This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 602 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We made it. It's week 17, the final week of the fantasy football season. Like I said at the start of the season, this 15 transaction show is my place to brain vomit. But like I also said at the start of the season, don't expect perfection. My fantasy football philosophy comes down to the fact that this stuff is hard to predict. So we should embrace that. There are ways to beat unpredictability when you know it's coming. And hopefully the journey of this episode each week throughout the 2021 season, hopefully it helps you see that. So let's win some fantasy championships. Now, before getting into the transactions this week that are completely waiver wire focused, I want to remind you about the FanDuel Sunday Million contest. The prize pool is a whopping $1.3 million, with first place taking home $250,000 this week. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel today and click on the NFL Sunday Million contest. Draft your lineup of players, sit back, and enjoy some Sunday NFL football. Go to FanDuel.com today to participate in the NFL Sunday Million. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Drop Terry McLaurin. It's crazy that I'm saying this during championship week. And maybe me saying to drop Terry McLaurin, maybe that seems like a hot take. But I don't even think it's that bold. McLaurin's averaged just 5.7 PPR points over his last 5. His target share per game is only 16.5% during that time. That's not like a terrible target share, but it's not very good in the Washington football team offense. That's not going to cut it. And then in week 17, McLaurin gets Philadelphia. The Eagles are the second toughest matchup in all of fantasy football when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. And the last time these two teams faced, just a couple of weeks ago, McLaurin caught just 2 balls for 51 yards. One of those receptions went for 46 yards. Of course, Terry McLaurin is a good wide receiver. Of course, something like this could backfire. But he's the type of name that if you drop him, your opponent might want to use him in a championship matchup. But he's not in that good of a spot. And he's within an offense that's just not good for him. So I think it's logical to drop McLaurin this week, even if your opponent scoops him up. Maybe it could backfire, but I think it's smart. Add Jordan Howard, Boston Scott, and Kenneth Gainwell. So Miles Sanders has a broken bone in his hand. That's why he missed a large chunk of Sunday's game against the Giants. He's going to be sidelined this weekend. That means we could see a lot more Jordan Howard, Boston Scott, and even Kenneth Gainwell in this offense. In week 16, Scott actually out-attempted Howard 12-9. Howard saw 4 more targets and he played more snaps. But keep in mind that Scott saw a lot of his work towards the end of the game. 7 of his 12 rush attempts came within the final 4 minutes in garbage time. Howard's played ahead of Scott in recent weeks, and he would be the one to sort of play the 1A role in that backfield without Miles Sanders, as long as he's healthy. Howard apparently had an injury himself in week 16, which was a stinger, but an MRI didn't reveal anything bad. So the hope is that he's going to go. That basically means that all 3 of these running backs should be added this week. Philly gets Washington, and when these two teams played in week 15, the Eagles running backs ran for 200 yards. If that repeats, more than one running back in this backfield could eat this week. Add Darrell Williams. I know Darrell Williams is not available in your league, but I have to play it smart here. It's championship week, and he's still out there in 40% of Yahoo leagues. Clyde Edwards-Helaire left Sunday's game against the Steelers with a collarbone injury. Fortunately, the x-ray on that collarbone came back negative. But there's always a chance that he's unable to go. And if he doesn't go, Williams gets elevated. He gets a big boost. In 5 games without CEH this year, Williams averaged 17.8 PPR points per game, and he had a running back rush share per game of almost 77%. Those are very good numbers, and it's because he's within a very good offense. And the Chiefs get the Bengals this week, and Cincinnati's been a plus matchup for running backs this year. So if Darrell Williams is out there, he needs to be added. Add Dare Ogunbowale. The biggest injury this past week in week 16 was definitely James Robinson, who tore his Achilles. He's out for the year. In his place was Dare Ogunbowale. He was the lead back for Jacksonville against the Jets. He handled 81% of the team's running back rushes, and he saw a target share of over 11%. Now, he should probably be added this week, but do keep in mind two things. Number one, he plays for the Jags. Number two, the Jaguars face the Patriots this week. The Patriots haven't been amazing against running backs this year or anything, but it's one of the best defensive units in the league. Is Jacksonville really going to move the ball that well against New England? You have to ask yourself that, because likely they're not going to. And so even though Ogunbowale could see a lot of work this week, it's not a great spot for him. So I would still add him, but temper expectations. Add Keyshawn Vaughn. So Keyshawn Vaughn had a pretty fluky week 16, let's be honest. He finished with 13 PPR points, but he scored 11 of those points on one play. He carried the ball just 7 times against the Panthers on Sunday. In most cases, I would not recommend picking up Keyshawn Vaughn this time of year. He's a number 2 running back, and this is championship week. But it's hard to ignore the matchup. The Buccaneers get the Jets this week, and according to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Bucs are 13.5-point favorites. And according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, no matchup in all of fantasy football is as good as running backs versus the New York Jets. So if the Bucs get out to a lead early, Keyshawn Vaughn could collect during garbage time. Add Rex Burkhead. I really think the perfect storm hit for Rex Burkhead in week 16. The Chargers have been bad against running backs all year long, so the matchup was there. And then Houston had a positive game script. They don't usually have a positive script. They were able to run the ball more, and that led to Burkhead carrying the ball 22 times for 149 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. Here's the thing, though. Burkhead's peripheral numbers were not spectacular. They really weren't any different than other weeks. He had a running back rush share of 64.7%, and he had a target share of 7.4%. Those numbers are almost identical, actually slightly worse than what he saw in week 15 against Jacksonville. So considering he was more of a sleeper play in past weeks, I think that's how we should view him in week 17. Drop Chuba Hubbard. I've talked about Hubbard a lot over the last month, basically since CMC's injury. And it's partially because he's been losing work to Amir Abdullah, but also the schedule. The Panthers have had a brutal schedule for running backs, and they finish off their fantasy season against the Saints. That's one of the toughest teams against running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Hubbard has averaged a 68% running back rush share per game over his last 3. That's not terrible. But that's also resulted in 3 straight single-digit PPR performances. You can let your opponent have Chuba Hubbard. Add Josh Palmer. So with Mike Williams and Jalen Guyton on the COVID list, rookie Josh Palmer got a bigger opportunity in this Chargers offense. Against Houston, he saw a 17.6% target share. He had 5 catches for 43 yards and a late-game touchdown. And according to Pro Football Focus, Palmer ran 5 more routes than any other Chargers wide receiver against the Texans. That includes Keenan Allen. Now, since Mike Williams is unvaccinated, he's going to miss week 17. That means Palmer has a very good shot to play starter snaps in this Justin Herbert-led offense. Add Jarrett Patterson. So that Washington-Dallas game was an absolute S show. It got out of hand, and that led to Antonio Gibson getting rest in the second half. That's why Jarrett Patterson had more rush attempts than Gibson in that game. But the thing is, Antonio Gibson was feeling iffy entering that game. He has that toe injury. So I think it is still worth holding on to Jarrett Patterson in deeper formats in case Antonio Gibson can't go this week. Add Isaiah McKenzie. So without Cole Beasley and Gabriel Davis on Sunday, Isaiah McKenzie was awesome. He played Beasley's slot role. He finished the day with a 27.9% target share. That turned into 11 receptions for 125 yards and a touchdown. Now, as we know, Cole Beasley is not vaccinated, but neither is Gabriel Davis. And because of when Davis tested positive, he's not going to play this week. And after McKenzie's performance, it wouldn't be surprising if we see him get that slot role in week 17, because Beasley's not going to practice all week. So you should add Isaiah McKenzie this week. Add Taysom Hill. So as it stands, Taysom Hill is rostered in 42% of Yahoo leagues. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he was put on the COVID list this past week, but that number should be a little bit higher because he has a shot to play in week 17 against the Panthers. And if he goes, I think that he's a strong waiver wire option. He's finished as a top 6 quarterback in 2 of his 3 starts this year, and he's ran the ball 11 times per contest. So far this year, and this extends into last year even, but so far this year, Hill has added 12.2 points per game through rushing alone. Add Trey Lance. So over the last couple of months, I've brought up Jimmy Garoppolo quite a bit on this show because he's had a really nice schedule. And over the last 9 weeks or so, he's actually not been that bad. He's averaged like 17 points per game. He was going to be called out as a streamer once again because San Francisco has a good matchup here in Week 17 against Houston. They're big favorites. They have a decent implied team total. But on Monday, news broke that he's dealing with a right thumb sprain. So it could be Trey Lance season. Like I said, there's a plus matchup against the Texans. And Lance has a lot of upside. In his only start this year, he ran the ball 16 times for 89 yards. He didn't have a massive fantasy day, but he scored almost 15 fantasy points without a touchdown on the ground and through the air. So of all streamers this week, if Trey Lance goes, I easily like him most. Add Carson Wentz. Now, another streamer that you could look at is Carson Wentz. To be fair, he's not the most traditional streamer in the world because his percent roster number right now over on Yahoo is 48%. But it's Week 17. I'm trying to cover everything. Indianapolis gets Vegas this week. And to be fair, they've been decent against quarterbacks this year. They rank 21st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. But the Colts have an implied team total, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, of over 26. That's tough to find these days. I think that alone makes Carson Wentz at least somewhat intriguing. Add the Chicago Bears defense. The Bears have not been good defensively this year. They rank 21st in the league in fantasy scoring after 16 weeks. But this week, they get the Giants. New York currently ranks as the 10th best opponent for opposing defenses in adjusted fantasy points allowed. But they've also allowed 3 top 5 defensive performances over their last 6. And since Daniel Jones' season-ending injury, New York's defensive opponents, they've scored 11.8 fantasy points per game. That's better than what Dallas, the first-ranked defense in fantasy football, that's better than their season-long average. So basically, the defense playing against this Giants team has been the defense won on a points per game basis. That's why you have to start Chicago. Add the Cleveland Browns defense. Let me get it out of the way. I would rather have the Bears than the Browns this week. But Cleveland's not a terrible option. They'll be in Pittsburgh this week, and the Steelers' offense has been a favorable one for defenses this year. And according to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Browns are 3-point road favorites in Heinz Field. And the over-under in this game is 41.5. So I think that they should be able to provide some sort of floor. But do keep in mind that Cleveland didn't do a whole lot for fantasy purposes when these two teams faced earlier in the season. It's just that there aren't many low-rostered options out there. So Cleveland, if you can't get Chicago, they do make some sense. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com, it's a little different this week. It's to hold your handcuffs. There are running backs who may appear to be healthy, and they probably are healthy. But with the way that COVID is spreading throughout the league, now is not the time to drop your handcuffs. I know it's tempting to get that roster space and to block your opponent, but a player could test positive for COVID anytime, and you should be ahead of that. This is really similar to what we saw with Austin Eckler last week. I made reference to Justin Jackson on the show because there was some spread happening in that Chargers offense among Chargers players. And then Eckler ended up testing positive. That can be the difference in winning and losing a championship. So please don't drop your handcuffs. You've got one more week of this. Play it safe and play it smart. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've got subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I will talk to you tomorrow with the 10 Trend Show.